Okay, everybody, welcome to the panel. Thank you for joining us for Connecting in Strange Times, the Antidote to Loneliness. As I mentioned before, my name is Patrick Sisson. I'm going to be moderating the panel, and we're gonna kick it off. So, alone together, amid the uncertain nature of the coronavirus crisis, this term has become a rallying cry for our collective response. We've all found new ways to be together, whether it's helping neighbors from a distance, getting on Zoom calls with family, or interacting with others via games like Animal Crossing. New ways to connect are great and inspiring and essential, but these last few months have also taught us tough lessons about being alone. Loneliness is something we all experience, but in a clinical sense, it's a serious and tragically overlooked global health risk, one that impacts 1/3 of American adults, and one our panel will discuss in much more depth. The drastic changes we've all made to our routines, wearing masks, working remotely if we have the privilege, quarantining at home, avoiding public spaces and gatherings when possible, are part of a larger battle for public health. The scope and seriousness of this mobilization suggests that we also can't forget about social and mental health. We're in the beginning stages of a social recession, an epidemic of loneliness that rival our other public health challenges. It's a big challenge, but one that offers a unique opportunity to rethink communication, community, care, and even how we design public spaces to combat loneliness and self-isolation. Today's panel is going to talk to you about loneliness, the difference between social isolation and loneliness, as you can see on the screen, how coronavirus is offering challenges and opportunities, and what may come next. I'm going to start by introducing our wonderful panel, and then we'll kick off the conversation. I'm going to leave about 15 minutes at the end of the hour for everybody to ask questions. So please feel free to send them in. Our moderator is going to send them to me. I'll do my best throughout the conversation, and especially in the last 15 minutes, to get these questions in front of our panel and give you answers. So once again, thank you for being a conversation, and let's get started with introductions. So I'm going to begin. Julianne Holt-Lunstad, professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University and the director of the social neuroscience lab there, was behind the seminal research that identified social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for early mortality. Julianne, kick us off here. Can you say a few words about why loneliness is such a big health crisis and how COVID-19 got you thinking differently about loneliness and social health?
Yeah, thanks. I'm really grateful that we can still connect here, even if we couldn't connect at South by Southwest in person. But yeah, so this is, this was an incredibly important topic pre-COVID-19, and I think the importance of it is even more magnified now. So most people certainly recognize some of the emotional effects of loneliness, but it's really underappreciated the extent to which isolation and loneliness affect our physical health. And we now have decades of research with robust scientific evidence that now establishes social isolation and loneliness as risk factors for premature mortality. So for example, my colleagues and I quantified this by looking at data worldwide. In fact, this includes data from over 3.4 million participants. And what we found was that loneliness increases risk for earlier death by 26%, social isolation by 29%, and living alone by 32%. And importantly, these are comparable to other well-known risk factors that we, of course, take very seriously for our health. But importantly, conversely, if you go to the next slide, what we found is also that being socially connected in a variety of ways, from the size of our social network to perceptions of support to how satisfied we are with our relationships, when we look across all of these, being socially connected increases our survival by 50%. So these are pretty profound health effects. And of course, this was all data that was collected pre-COVID-19. And so if you go to the next slide, the accumulation of this evidence was really leading to greater recognition of the health importance of this. So in fact, the UK appointed a minister for loneliness and published a national health policy to really address the issue of loneliness. And similarly, I served on a National Academy of Science committee that recently just published a report on the medical and healthcare relevance of social isolation and loneliness. And that report is available to the public. So we had this, and do have this really robust evidence of the health effects, but importantly, this also affects a large portion of the population. So even pre-COVID, the prevalence rates of loneliness, depending on the estimate, ranged anywhere from 22% to over 50% in the general public. And some evidence that has been done post or currently, how people are coping with COVID-19 and the stay-at-home restrictions and the social distancing suggests that this has increased by 20 to 34% across the population. And both pre and post, some of this evidence suggests that this is actually highest in younger adults. And so as we start considering the public health relevance of all of this, we really can't ignore the importance of social isolation and loneliness as well.
Yeah, thank you, Julianne. That definitely want to dig into that a lot more, because I feel like like we said before, sort of the health challenges here encompass so much more perhaps than maybe we're already taking in, even though that's, you know, quite expansive. So I want to introduce our second panelist, Jeremy Nobel, a doctor, artist, and researcher, a faculty member at Harvard's Chan School for Public Health and Harvard Medical School, and the president of the Foundation for Art and Healing and founder of the UnLonely Project. So Jeremy's dedicated his career to understanding and figuring out ways that art can be a part of coping with and healing and confronting loneliness. So I wanna start with you, Jeremy. You think about the arts as a part of healing and connection all the time in your practice. Tell us about what you think the rest of us can learn about how the creative arts can help address loneliness, and especially examples that point to how this can be such a powerful tool amid the current pandemic and the social isolation that Julianne was talking about.
I think it's a really important question, Patrick, especially right now as we imagine loneliness being more challenging than ever before. And I can imagine people in the audience saying, gee, you're a primary care physician, you're on Harvard Medical School faculty. Shouldn't you be talking about new ways, antiviral treatments and antibiotic screening? And of course, that's a critical part of addressing the crisis. But I think hiding in plain sight, if the problem is loneliness, is the incredible power of the arts, documented over centuries, to inspire, engage, and connect people. And so you mentioned the UnLonely Project. That's a signature initiative of the Foundation for Art and Healing. 3 goals. First, to increase awareness about loneliness and its toxicity. So as Julianne mentioned, loneliness won't just make you miserable, it will kill you. So in addition to it being the leading preventable risk factor for depression, suicide, substance abuse, it has this increased risk of early mortality. But the second goal of the UnLonely Project, and that's why I'm delighted to be here with you and panelists and the audience today, is to address the stigma around loneliness. There is a huge resistance to talking about it, to people self-identifying having loneliness. We'll talk more about this because as the entire world is now familiar with loneliness, maybe we'll be less stigmatized about it and can move forward. And the third is to activate programming that use creative arts in ways to really enable people to share their story, connect with each other through the authenticity of personal disclosure. And we'll talk more about all of that. But I think it's important for the audience to know, and you have this pyramid of vulnerability slide up here, is we're all at risk for isolation and loneliness, 100% of us. And what happens in the interaction of daily experiences, whether it's, you know, the loss of a loved one or a disappointment of some sort or a critique, that those of us at risk for isolation move to a higher level, the mid-tier of the pyramid, where we begin to disconnect and isolate. And some people then can kind of adjust, they can recover, they can reconnect. And then those who do, they go back to the bottom tier at risk for isolation. Those who don't move to the top tier. And from both the public health perspective and a medical perspective, that's where we focus a lot of attention. Those are people who are so burdened by loneliness that they are held back in their social activities, but also experience the burdens of mental health challenges, depression, suicidality, and so on, but also the physical health problems. So what does this mean to all of us, and certainly for what the arts can do? There's an argument right now that what COVID-19 has done is taken all of us from the bottom tier of the pyramid to the mid-tier. So doesn't mean we're gonna, kind of die of loneliness, but it does mean we need to pay attention. And for some people, and we're very concerned about that subset of the population who are already struggling with loneliness, older adults, marginalized populations, people who already have a major illness, caregivers. These are people who are already struggling, and COVID is gonna, no doubt, push many of these people to the top tier of the pyramid. So that's the challenge at both individual health and public health. Let's unpack the arts a little bit and see what they can offer. And so, the arts rewire our brain, right? What you see, sense, taste, touch, smell changes how you think about the world around you, changes how you make sense of thoughts and memories, and in a sense, position you in your own life. And the arts have always been a way of making sense of the world and sharing your thoughts and feeling about the world with others. So traditionally, we think about the big four: music, visual arts, language arts, dance. But for many people, what we call the common three or the big three are culinary arts, right? The producing of a beautiful meal or a dish, right? The taste, the smell, the color, the design, right? Or textile arts, sewing, crocheting, knitting, and so on. Or even gardening, which a friend of mine continues to refer to as the world's slowest performing art. So we're all artists. So for people who say, I'm not an artist, I bet that you do one of those things. So how does the art work? Well, we've spent quite a bit of time kind of looking at art making and art enjoyment, and we've identified these three very separate, important, but overlapping conditions, and they're all neuroactive and socially active. So first is in the making of art itself. I'm sure out in the audience are a lot of makers. I know on this panel are people who make art. And so it puts you in the moment. It puts you in touch with thoughts and feelings that are otherwise often difficult to engage with and express. And more than that, it allows you to make something. So unlike meditation, which is a deep and enriched personal experience, you create an artifact. That is recruiting other parts of your brain, right? So, the neocortex, the neuromuscular cortex. And so you're out there and you're making something. And what you make then goes to the second piece, which is something you can share. So for instance, Julianne is sharing that beautiful painting that's behind her. She may be too embarrassed to say that she made that beautiful painting, and it's being shared with all of us right now. So I hope you don't mind, Julianne. And so that's an example of what the arts do. And they do it often in the background, right? So it doesn't have to be an art show. It doesn't have to be an art exhibit. And then lastly, the arts bring us into ourselves in connection with the person who made the art. And a beautiful example of that for COVID-19 is the Rotterdam Symphony early on playing Beethoven's Ode to Joy as a virtual orchestra. It really brought me to tears, even the recollection of it. And how could that be that somebody who's been dead for over 150 years can bring us to tears? And this is the magic of it, and it's about connection. So that's why I think the arts have been a powerful resource for connecting, particularly now with this acceleration of challenge. I think we owe it to ourselves on a personal level, community level. certainly a public health level, to pay more attention to it, take it more seriously.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. It makes a lot of sense. And based on the photos of sourdough bread I've seen over the last couple of weeks, we have a flowering of the arts right now. But seriously, you know, looking at the progression of our panelists here, Julianne told us about sort of the scope of the issue. Jeremy's telling us about one of the ways that we can really think about how we can respond to the issue. But at the same time, we're confronted with the just reality of being isolated and alone. We're told to stay away from each other. We're told to only communicate through digital means like this Zoom chat right now. And that, you know, begs a lot of questions about how we utilize and how we design our space. So that gets me to our last panelist, Erin. Erin Peavey is an award-winning architect and researcher and a vice president at HKS, focusing on the intersection of health and the built environment. So Erin, with all these stay-at-home orders, the sort of avoidance we're doing to sort of protect each other and protect ourselves, you know, connecting in real life obviously has been much, much harder. How are you seeing communities sort of carve out and create space to interact, to talk to each other, maybe to have these kind of art interactions that Jeremy's talking about, and basically to sort of prevent the loneliness that we feel at this time?
Awesome, thanks. First, I just want to say how exciting and thrilling it's been to work with you guys. And this last year, you know, preparing for South by Southwest and learning from and just the shared passion that we all have for this cause has been really humbling. And I just so appreciate everybody coming and spending this time with us, because I know that you have a lot of stuff on your plate. So, right, when we were planning this, we were thinking of this as, what are the ways that physical space can help foster connection? A lot of times that's in the background, and we're not thinking about it as the top thing that we should consider as we design buildings or as we think about our communities. We think of a lot of different things, but we're not necessarily thinking of the physical environment. And so this led me into the scientific literature to say, there's more here. I hear bits and pieces. And through that, what I really found was this framework here that you see, these 6 pieces of really what can help us to connect, what makes a great third place, what makes great places for connection. But much to what you just mentioned, this is all like come into the blur. I mean, how do we navigate our way out of this, and or I guess into and through this, right, is a much better way to say it. And I think we're beginning to see how this same framework can be helpful to think about both charting digital and physical environments as we go forward. There are still tons of ways to connect in person as well as virtually, and a lot of things that are vital for shared connection. And one of the things that I'm seeing even in my community is I've never seen so many people out in their front yards on the weekends, like talking with their neighbors, and yes, all from a socially appropriate distance, but really coming together and getting to know one another. And then from a digital side, people using apps like Nextdoor and saying, hey, I'm here to help, how can I help? And so I think it's, you know, it's beautiful to watch that come out of people. Yeah, and so I'm excited about our conversation today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll just talk.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to kick off the conversation. I'm going to start asking some questions. Everyone who is joining, and thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Please send in your questions. We're looking forward to throwing that in the mix. I'm going to start and ask a question, kind of a new question to the panel right now. So I think one of the things that a lot of people have been dealing with is kids. They've had to figure out like the tough juggling of watching kids and working, the tough issues of schooling and things like that. And I think this is something that's been on a lot of people's mind. And I want to ask about kids and loneliness. How should we be talking to kids about this issue? What should we be doing to, what are the activities that we could be doing to help them sort of process this and understand this? And maybe what are the ways we could be designing the spaces we inhabit, or thinking about the spaces that kids are using and playing in to help them cope with what is a really difficult situation for everybody?
I'm happy to, get the ball rolling, Patrick. And I think there's a growing real concern about the potential damage, if you will, to the couple of things. One is the shift of normalcy and routine for kids. Then the exposure to anxiety of their parents or anxiety of the people around them, and then also the growing anxiety of their peers. And there's quite a bit of discussion in both the public health dialogues, but also the pediatric dialogues about very specific things to do, mostly to recognize it. But then if you take a step back, what can we do about it? And I think anything we can do to invite children to express their anxieties, their thoughts and feelings. This is work we actually were very involved in after 9/11, when kids in the 5 boroughs were traumatized, frankly, not as much by the events because they were beyond their understanding, but the images of the planes going into the Twin Towers and people on fire falling out or jumping that were played over and over again in the media, and that was traumatizing. And very relatively simple expressive exercises to just share what they were feeling were tremendously helpful. Now, what we're into is very different from a single, impact event. Whatever we're in, it's more of a marathon than a sprint. And we may need to develop some new cultural styles around sharing, family styles and so on, even as typical family patterns are being disrupted. So I think we're all, kind of going through a steep learning curve, but I think it's important to keep an eye on the issue because it's well known that adverse childhood events, of which trauma is certainly one, can lead to significant increased risk for mental and physical health challenges as one grows older.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. And Julianne, I'd love to see and ask you if you have any thoughts on just, I guess, broad-based question. What does the research say? Or what have you pulled from, previous situations? Obviously, it's hard to find a comparison, but what can you sort of maybe assume from what you've heard before?
So when we look at prevalence rates, the highest prevalence has been among Gen Z. Now, of course, that doesn't speak to, these surveys didn't get young children, right? So it doesn't speak to those younger ages. But, our teens and college students, in addition to thinking about small children, how they're coping, teens and young adults of that age may be struggling as well. One of the things we have to recognize is that this situation is also significantly disrupting these kinds of major life transitions. Not only from a young age to an old age, from birth to marriages to death, but we're having virtual high school graduations this Friday, right? And many college students have this time that is supposed to be, often moving away from home and gaining this independence from their parents. These students are all moving home and doing their coursework virtually. This may have a lasting impact on these younger generations beyond this point. And so we really need to think about this, because prior research has shown that these life transitions, transition from living at home to the transition to living away from home, so attending a university, the transition to marriage or parenthood, the transition to retirement. These transitions have been trigger points that put people at increased risk for social isolation and loneliness. And with these life transitions being so significantly disrupted, this is something that we should definitely pay attention to in terms of potential risk.
Can I also just say that your question to me also makes me really appreciative of Jeremy's work I know for a lot of us, the arts was an important part of how we coped, growing up with difficult emotions or with difficult times. Those are the times that we got physically active in making of some sort or another, and I'm seeing that all around me. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in to tell everyone who's listening, I've gotten about a dozen really excellent questions. So please keep them coming in. I'm writing them down. I'm going to get to as many as I can. This has been, you have better questions than me, so keep them coming and make me look good. So just to keep on this topic, because these are some of the things that have come in. So someone asked about, and I'm sorry I'm missing your name, someone asked about their teenage son is doing a lot of work at school, and that is mostly online and through Zoom. What are some spaces or ideas or places where they can socially interact with friends in a safe manner at this time?
Yeah, I mean, so, right, first of all, it's like, what's the clay that you're working with? But I think that one of the most important things that we have in this time are sort of threshold or in between spaces and public spaces. I mean, it is really exciting to see people start to take back their streets. Because a lot of times we talked about them being the most underutilized third place, that they belong to all of us, but we're not using them. And so, you know, with the reduction of cars that are on the roads right now, I'm seeing New York and Toronto and Seattle and a lot of different places starting to shut down certain roads so they can just be used for people that want to be, you know, distant from each other, but still connecting with each other. Or, you know, there's a lot of different types of ways that you can connect while not being, you know, extremely close to one another. Yeah, that's, I mean, I think of my front porch. I'm like a front porch crusader, but it is where I regularly connect with my neighbors' boys, and I watch, you know, I watch them. I don't get super close to them, but we talk, and, you know, we talk about their day, and they talk to my daughter, and I mean, it is such a beautiful connection. Mother's Day, we, like, a bunch of the neighbors just like dropped off Mother's Day gifts and sort of walked away. But, you know, it's just so wonderful to have that support from all ages, you know?
Yeah, and I should say that was from Jennifer Stewart who asked that question. So sorry I didn't identify you earlier.
Jennifer.
Can I kind of take this in a slightly different direction? This is another question someone asked that I thought was really interesting. So how do you sort of prepare children to be alone? And I guess that would kind of fall into the idea of how do you explain the situation, which we've touched on before, but this also applies to just about anybody. Like, how do you sort of talk about this? This could apply to kids, but, you know, maybe how our leaders should be explaining this situation to us. What is the right sort of language and discussion that we should be having around this?
I don't think there's.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Julianne. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Are you sure?
Go ahead.
So, you know, although I'm a professor of psychology, I'm not a child psychologist, so I should clarify that. But, you know, I am a mother to two teenage boys, and so I've tried to apply some of what I know about the physical and mental health effects of being socially connected with my own kids. And so one of the things that we talk about is why we're doing this, and I frame it in a way in which it still helps us feel connected. We're doing this to help prepare or to help protect the people that we love. We don't want grandma and grandpa to get sick. We don't want our friends and neighbors to get sick. We're doing this because we care about these other people. And so part of that comes from how we frame the situation to help kids understand why we're doing it. And that in that way, there's more of a sense of feeling connected versus isolated in our actions. We've also made efforts to try to, for instance, support other people, whether it's, you know, yesterday there was a graduation drive-by where the neighbors would, someone had graduated and each person kind of drove by in their car and honked and waved and you know, expressed their congratulations, and supporting that. We've together as a family, we've sewn masks we've done a lot of things to help us feel connected to our neighbors, to our family members, to our community. And so the more that we can do those kinds of things, that can help foster some of these connections.
Yeah, so that sort of everyone's in it together kind of aspect.
Let me just, you know, I love that very practical, tactical guidance. And I think one of the really big opportunities here, to go back to the question as I heard it, is, you know, kids are more alone, is to really get clear that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. That being alone can be such a positive experience of spiritual connection with yourself and others that we even have a very fancy word for it. We call it solitude, right? So, but it's an educational opportunity, but not to lecture to our kids, you know, about, oh, being alone is a privileged opportunity, but give them the tools to experience it as a positive opportunity. You know, give them, you know, kind of ideas and thoughts they can explore in their own imagination, creativity. I mean, in a way, this really gets back to the power of the arts to put you in touch with yourself. And I think it could be a huge lesson for all of us to be clear about that being alone isn't something to be terrified about, and very different than being lonely.
And can I also add, this was a question that someone else had asked, older adults, especially older adults without technology, that is a very much at-risk group, both for the pandemic and coronavirus going around right now, but of course for the issues that we're talking about. What are your advice for, you know, family members who want to help out, others, neighbors who want to help out, what we should do as a society to make sure we're taking care of this very vulnerable population?
So we've been doing quite a bit of work tactically in the communities with older adults, and I know Julianne has studied this, and she mentioned the recent National Academy of Science report on the toxicity of social isolation for isolated seniors, right? Many of whom are lonely. So it's worse than ever, right, for isolated seniors. There's now fear of death, there's fear of and also bereavement, of losing your friends, and grieving is different, and interacting with your family, it's all changed. So then how can we support older adults? And there are some conventional technologies. So we have, through our Aging UnLonely, we have websites, we have all kinds of wonderful programs, but we're developing a very simple telephone-based program called Phone and Reflect, where we have somebody with a certain degree of empathy, they don't have to be a mental health professional, call an older adult and actually move through some questions that are more than just how's the weather where you're living today, or what food do you have. Those are important tactical things, but how are you feeling about what you're leaving behind in the world, or could? You know, older adults are ready to talk about legacy. You know, how are you thinking about your life, meaning and purpose at this stage of your life? You can have those conversations over the phone and connect with people. That's in addition to all the other wonderful things you see of people driving by older adults' homes with signs and, you know, happy birthday, grandma. So it's not one thing, but it's a recognition that it is a population at risk.
Well, and Jeremy, I think that you bring up such good points in the ways that, like, it is important not to just have connections to people, but to connect with people, because it is not just about the number, it is about the quality, right? And so a lot of times that quality can come from unexpected places, like exactly what you're describing. The ability to have those broader conversations, I think, is such a beautiful gift. And yes, almost everybody has a telephone or a mailbox, or, you know, the ability to be able to reach out on a somewhat regular basis so the person can look forward to your phone call and, you know that you're thinking about them. Yeah.
Well, and I'll add, you know, I've spent quite a bit of time in my career studying the effects of social support and perceived social support, the extent to which you feel that you've got someone you can count on, that someone will be available to you if you need emotional support or advice or a favor. This perception of support has profound effects, not only on our emotional well-being, but we've demonstrated that it affects our physiology, and it's associated with a 35% reduction in risk for earlier mortality. And so the quality of these interactions are critical. And in fact, it's the perceived, not necessarily received, because of course, you know, you can get a phone call and it may not be the best if someone's nagging or you don't feel it's sincere or whatever, it's not going to have the same kind of effect as this perceived support, the extent to which it's genuine, meaningful conversations. So yes, by all means, reach out to the people in your lives and let them know you're there, that you care. Because it not only helps them, it helps you too.
Totally.
There's
Yes,
something said about this
exactly.
community-wide activity, like I'm, you know, putting a chalk art on my street, or I'm hanging banners on my wall, or I'm calling people, even if they're not responding. There's something, the perception there, the activity, the action of like we're all together does have a big effect. A lot of people have been asking about sort of how this, like sort of the pivot we might have with this and moving forward in terms of what comes next, how we start thinking about mental health differently. I want to get to that in 1 second, but first I want to ask a question about sort of physical space. And Erin, we've seen so many cities do things like they're opening up streets to walkers and pedestrians and getting rid of cars. You see people, you know, debating really closely, like exactly what kind of activity should happen where. And I'd love to get your take on, you know, strategies that you've seen at work. And of course, the other panelists can jump in as well. Strategies that have worked, places that have worked, types of places that are maybe the best for these kind of interactions, because, you know, we're all hungering for them right now.
Yeah, right. Well, I think, you know, there was a recent article that came out that was covering, you know, some of what's happening right now as Wuhan reopens, and talking about, like, I don't know how many people have sort of seen the number of spaces that we have for cars in parking lots behind, you know, wherever our gathering spaces are. But a lot of these, you know, restaurants can expand out into these spaces and be able to start to have outdoor seating that takes on a new look and that's, you know, safe for everybody. I love that drive-in movie theaters are now coming back. Like, I just think that's so awesome and novel. And yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I think that there's a lot of different examples of it. I do think that though there is like this one thing that I feel like is important, which is making what is socially appropriate, like that distance, easy for you to understand. I've seen a number of different campaigns of just like, you know, being able to understand how close you are, and then starting to like be comfortable talking about it and joking about it with other people, so that, you know, you're able to keep some of those spaces. But yeah.
So you're seeing like, yeah, these streets and parks, and I know Vilnius, Lithuania, for instance, is opening up most of the downtown for sort of open air cafes. Like, these are ways to sort of gradually bring things back. I want to go back to these questions about sort of mental health, and ask, you know, there's obviously, and I don't mean to put light on the seriousness of the situation, but is there a silver lining in a way that we are all sort of experiencing this loneliness in different ways, in different degrees at the same time, and changing the way that society looks at these things? People were very curious about how this changes the way we think about and fund and support mental health, and the way that we talk about what this means to us. Like, how do you see those things changing, and maybe what are goals we should have as things change?
Well, maybe I can start off again with bad news and a silver lining both. So there is no question, it goes back to that pyramid of vulnerability, that these dramatic recent events, particularly for people with already existing mental health challenges, whether it's body disorders, depression, addiction disorders, are going to find these incredibly challenging times, because they get to the heart often of what is behind these disorders, a lot of people, and limits naturally occurring positive factors that are often very stabilizing and give people the ability to self-regulate. So I think we are going to see some problems now, and there's a lot of recognition of this, and we all need to be thinking about how to you know, be more in touch with the people around us who we think are vulnerable. And so we just, for instance, in our web-based engagement that we have, Stuck at Home Together, we know people are going to come to that site with some really challenging mental conditions, and so we make sure there's guidance to acute mental health. So this is all the bad news. What's the good news? Something that's really been difficult in the mental health world is the level of stigma and negative social perspective of mental illness. That's been a problem for centuries. This isn't, a 20th or 21st century issue. And I think one of the silver lining opportunities now for COVID-19 is we're all in it together and faced by a common enemy that is destabilizing our individual lives and our social lives. And I think if we can recognize that, it actually can not only get past stigma, so we can talk about loneliness, talk about anxiety, talk about depression, because we're facing a common enemy. It's not because we're broken or defective, but we can learn how to do that as a cultural and social activity. I'm a great optimist about that. And now
does this include, say, telehealth, remote things? Like what are the vehicles for that, especially while we go through what could be sort of a new normal for a while? Like, are there specific programs or ideas or things you've seen that offer a lot of this optimism for expanding treatment and getting people to talk more about this?
Anything that allows and invites people in a safe space to tell their story. So telehealth typically is within a therapeutic relationship, and we can expand access to therapeutic services for mental health. And we will and should, and that's going to happen. And there are also just social experiences that are incredibly mental health stabilizing, giving people the experience of being seen, recognized, valued. And again, bring it back to the arts. It's unifying to share your story through the arts, because when people enjoy and appreciate your photograph, your poem, your garden, your loaf of bread, then you feel validated in that recognition, and it stabilizes your sense of self-esteem and ability to care for yourself.
Are we seeing an era where, like, and this is, I'm curious if other people also have thoughts on this as well, where, technology is really helping out here? We've heard years and years of, and I'm not going to say there's data behind this, but just years and years of people saying, hey, social media is bad for us. This is not good. It's causing isolation and loneliness. And now we're more dependent on technology than ever. And I know I just mentioned telehealth, but I'm curious, like, is there a better role for this? Can we evolve sort of better habits, and are there better forms of this sort of social media communication that can really help right now?
I don't want to hog the microphone, but I will. So go ahead, Julianne. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, when it comes to connecting online, digitally, via a variety of forms of technology, first of all, we just need to recognize that we don't have as much evidence when it comes to that. We have decades of evidence of the protective effects of interacting face-to-face in real life, but less robust evidence when it comes to this. And partly that's due because of the complex nature of the variety of types and of tools and how you can use them. Generally speaking, what data suggests is how you use them matters. So passive types of usage, just scrolling through newsfeed, that
right, the consuming
seems to be
sitting back, yeah,
that seems to be associated with poorer kinds of outcomes, whereas more active use of them to connect to people seems to be associated with better kinds of outcomes. But the other thing is what the evidence suggests is that these tools may help in terms of what the short-term kinds of effects of interacting with someone, some of the reward centers in the brain, those immediate kinds of effects. But we have less evidence of them satisfying those long-term needs and roles of relationships. And we simply have less evidence of the long-term effects on health also.
And can I just ask a follow-up? You mentioned long-term effects, and a couple of people were curious, keeping in mind that this is, of course, quite an unprecedented situation. what does the clinical research tell you, if anything, about sort of the long-term effects of the kind of situation we're going through, being, feeling lonely, being isolated for months and months at a time?
First, I always want to be careful because when I talk about these health effects, I don't want people to use this as justification to disregard recommendations.
100%, yeah, 100%.
And so, of course, we're balancing various risks for our health, right? And so there's the very immediate risks associated with the virus. And then there are these long-term effects on health of being socially isolated and lonely. And what I would suspect, of course, there are a lot of unknowns, right? But even if isolation and loneliness rates were to be stable, we have a pretty good idea of the risk for not only premature mortality, but risk for heart attacks, stroke, type 2 diabetes. But there's also short-term kinds of effects on our physiology. And so this can affect our blood pressure, stress hormones, inflammation. It can even influence how quickly wounds heal and our susceptibility to cold viruses and even respiratory illnesses. And so there may be some effects, particularly among those who have underlying health conditions. Some of these short-term physiological responses can potentially trigger some of those underlying health conditions. And so one of the things this situation has really got me thinking about is what we anticipate these longer term effects, not only if this increased sense of isolation and loneliness remains stable over time, but also even if we are able to rebound and get back to pre-existing levels. The work on adverse childhood events and other kinds of traumatic events show that those can have lasting effects years later on people's health. And so, I think this is a really important opportunity for scientists to learn from this. Whether it's the immediate health effects, but also how technology is playing a role, how physical space is playing a role, because this is a really important opportunity to learn.
Someone mentioned physical touch. I want to ask just one more quick follow-up. How do we have any research on the lack of physical touch over long periods of time and what that does?
Sorry, I don't want me to speak again, but I've actually done some research on physical touch, and so there's evidence that from animal research to human research, this has spanned the importance of even in animals, grooming behaviors. To mother, child, infant attachment. There's decades of research that shows that the importance of touch in terms of cognitive development, physical development. This ties back to some of the very early research that showed that infants in custodial care that lacked human touch and contact failed to thrive and even were at greater risk for death. But our research has also shown that things just as simple as holding hands, hugging, sitting closely cuddled together can affect the neuropeptide oxytocin, which has been linked to not only social bonding, but stress regulation. And so there's even research out of Carnegie Mellon that has shown that hugging has been linked to immune functioning. And so this really leads to this important question of what's the role of touch going forward in this now COVID situation where everything is contactless and we're probably going to want to keep our distance from people and avoid shaking hands and avoid, you know, kissing hello. And so I think it raises important questions on how we move forward in the coming years.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
oh, go ahead.
Erin, please go ahead.
No, so some of what you're bringing up, I think so much about sort of different pieces of the conversation and about physical touch and about some of the different types of housing solutions that were already starting to come up. I know that we had all talked about sort of different co-housing with seniors. So the idea of college students that stay and live in an extra room that seniors have, or the greenhouse concept, which is, you know, smaller groups of people coming together. And I think, you know, understanding the very real need to reduce spread, and also a very real need that, you know, right now we're having to downplay, but of being hugged and of being connected with other people, and thinking, are there ways that we may want to rethink the rise that we're seeing in people living alone? Like, even if they're non-traditional ways of living together. I know that we've talked about, you know, ways of densifying downtowns by having people set up, you know, casitas, or ways where people can, you know, come in and be with one another. So anyways, I think that deserves some thinking about as we say, what do we want to design as our future?
Yeah, and I think that sets up one of the questions I want to perhaps end on or start ending on, and I think this applies to everyone's sort of area of specialty in a different way. This idea of like a bit of a new normal, or we're going to be adjusting as this crisis evolves and changes. I'd love to hear all your thoughts on what do you think you'd want to say, or what should policymakers and community leaders know about loneliness, and what are some of the maybe policy ideas or plans they should be initiating right now? It's pretty broad, but I think that'll help us touch on a lot of the different topics we've run on. Erin, would you want to start and just sort of continue with your thoughts on, you know, urbanism, design, housing, where you think that should go?
Yeah, great question. You know, one of the things that I don't think that our policymakers are nearly aware enough of, which is part of why I wrote the report, was that social capital, our social health, our loneliness, and all of our emotional well-being is being indicated as being infected by the places that we live, by the places that we spend time, and that a lot of the ways that we've prioritized city development is actually detrimental to the ways that we were meant to live together in community. And that there's a lot of fairly easy solutions to that relate to, you know, zoning and what incentives are in place, and even just holding people accountable by saying, okay, this is great. What are you doing to make sure that this building or this place is helping people to connect with one another? I think there's a lot of great resources out there, and I want people to be, you know, holding each other accountable for social health, not just, you know, economic development.
Maybe I'll you know, I think it's a really terrific question, not just what can government leaders do on policy, what can all of us do? And I think part of it is recognizing, first of all, taking it seriously as an issue, as this webinar is doing, I think is increasingly happening everywhere, right? That loneliness is a serious issue. And I also think we can't put the accountability for addressing it in any one entity, right? It can't be a government activity. It can't be an individual family activity. It's community, which means the entities that constitute community, which are everything from employers, faith-based groups, schools, retailers. I mean, it's all of us. And I also think it's an opportunity to think about another word or concept that's very related to loneliness, and it hasn't come up, which is the concept of belonging. And it's such an obvious word, we slide right by it, you know, but do we belong to our communities or some group within our community so someone sees us as a valued member of something bigger than even a, you know, as important as family is a family, but that's an important belonging opportunity also. Mm-hmm. And so I think beginning to celebrate these concepts as not just theoreticals, but as fundamental to community health, social health, even economic growth, I think we're really, never waste a good crisis. Now's the time to be asking
Right.
these questions.
And I think
putting
people
the
are
infrastructure-
hungry for those messages of sort of community and bonding. And it can feel
Absolutely.
incredibly hard to say that in today's environment on many levels.
Yeah. Well, I think if there's ever a time to say it now, now's the time. And then researchers like Julianne will get the funding and the support to do the critical research. So you can have wonderful, high-level concepts, but we have to measure it. Otherwise, we're aspirational, but 3 years from now, how do we know we're on the right track?
Yeah, well said.
So I guess I'm last.
Yeah.
Even before the current crisis, I wrote a few pieces on how social connection should be prioritized in public health policy, and had really tried to make the case of not only how many organizations are looking at health in all policy, but that we should look for social in all policy, from healthcare to housing to transportation to the environment, that we look at how these policies can either help or hinder socialization. And I think this situation has really brought to the forefront just how integrated our connections to others are across every aspect of life, because we've seen how these restrictions have affected every aspect of our life. And so with this recognition, we're working, I think the nations are looking at how to help mitigate an economic recession. Well, we need to think about how to mitigate a social recession. How do our policies moving forward affect us socially? How do we protect public health that can protect us from this virus, but also protect us socially as well? And so this is going to be something that is going to need, a lot of involvement from every level, as Jeremy mentioned. But I think it's one that's critically important.
Mm-hmm. Well, hey, I think we're just in the hour, so I want to thank the three incredible panelists here who did such a great job of talking about this topic and enlightening us and making us think. And also want to thank everyone who tuned in and gave questions. Again, you definitely make my job a lot easier, but more importantly, you really participated in the conversation and asked some really, really great questions. So I really appreciate it. And yeah, I want to does anyone else in the panel want to say any final words before we head out?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for
a great final word. I'll say thank you also really to the fellow panelists, to the people who made this happen. Patrick, for wonderful moderation, for the audience that took time out of it today, for the great questions and the chance to be together.
Yeah, and looking forward to a time when we can all connect in real life.
Yeah,
And stay happy.
We'll bring us back to Austin and have some breakfast tacos all together, okay? I promise, that'll happen one day. Well, thank you, everybody, and thanks for everyone who helped out and participated. And stay safe and have a good day.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye.